That's the Sunday papers, and with the intergenerational report released this week, we're joined by the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Andrew Lee, from our Canberra studios. Good morning, welcome.
Good morning, Barry.
When you look at that report, perhaps the most sobering thought is the prospect of budget deficits for another 40 years. Now, surely that's something that should inspire not just governments, but oppositions to start thinking about some tough decisions.
Barry, it's absolutely right that we need to be looking at measures which are going to ensure that the budget returns to a sustainable surplus. Labor in government put in place over $100 billion worth of savings. After the global financial crisis, we used stimulus to save jobs. We put in place a 2% real spending cap and stuck to it. Doing things like means testing the private health insurance rebate, one of the fastest growing areas of the budget, and curtailing the baby bonus, both opposed by the coalition. So we've got the track record on making sustainable decisions.
But if you just relied on what you've done in government, you would still have these surpluses as far as the eye can see. A lot more has to be done.
Certainly, Barry, it's an ongoing task, and in government we were very careful to make sure that we made those sustainable decisions. But what you don't want to do is to, as the Americans say, eat the seed corn. What I worry about this document is that it's too much about the issues of demography and debt, important as they are, not enough about the big future challenges facing Australia. Inequality, climate change, innovation, the rise of Asia. These things are largely absent from the document, and as a result we've got a heavily politicised document trying to score points rather than one which takes that great opportunity to look at the Australia of 2050, what we want to be and how we're going to get there. It's less about the future of 24 million Australians and too much about the political skin of 20 cabinet ministers.
But I think you also accept you can never sit on your hands, and incrementally you have to continue to deal with this issue. What would Labor do? What would Labor do to make the budget situation improved?
Oh, Barry, this week we brought down a policy on multinational taxation, an unusual thing for an opposition to do, given that we brought it down in the first half of the parliamentary term. It's a $2 billion package, informed by work from the OECD. I travelled to the OECD last year and met with officials there. I've held roundtables speaking with experts, and we had the policy costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. That policy that we announced with Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen is one which is carefully calibrated to make sure that our system is fair, that we have a level playing field across business.
But it's not as simple as it used to be, though, in that area, is it? Given that you're now looking at technological companies with global reach, it's not as if you're just keeping an eye on the manufacturing industry, for example.
That's completely right, Barry, and your comment goes to the heart of why multinational profit shifting has become such a big issue around the globe. What our package does in four parts is to deal with issues of debt shifting, of hybrid instruments, data matching, and giving the ATO the resources it needs. There's potentially a bigger long-term agenda, and we need to be engaging with other countries to look, for example, at whether there's a possibility of coordinated action. But this policy does, I think, tighten up loopholes in Australia's tax laws, and it's entirely consistent with our tax treaties. Unlike, for example, Joe Hockey's thought bubble of a Google tax last year, which by my read would be inconsistent with Australia's international obligations.
All right, you're talking about a couple of $1 billion, but it's going to require a lot more than that, of course, with healthcare doubling over the next 40 years, the cost of healthcare quadrupling in the case of aged care. I mean, a challenge of that size is surely going to demand taxes rise, it's going to demand that spending be constrained, the whole lot.
Barry, we certainly need to make carefully calibrated decisions, and one of the things I think you ought to take out of our multinational tax announcement is not just that Labor is serious about policy reform, but the way in which we will go about producing those policies. Engaging with experts, having things carefully costed through the Parliamentary Budget Office. We're keen to use this time in opposition wisely. I'm training for my first marathon at the moment, and one of the bits of advice I get is to train the way you want to race. In my case, that's pretty slowly. But the coalition, their training for office was essentially attacks and three-word slogans. And so when they got to the race, they didn't have those big picture ideas for creating a better Australia. We're not going to make the same mistake.
If you're training for a marathon, you run every day, so just one policy won't do it. what the community will need is a lot of policies from Labor. You'll need to roll them out regularly. Is that the plan through this year?
Absolutely, Barry. As Chris Bowen said at our press conference, this is the opening salvo in the battle of ideas. It's really important that we're engaged with those questions of how to tackle growing inequality, which is now as high as it's been in 3/4 of a century. I was speaking to a bloke called Bill at one of my mobile offices the other day. He said he was really concerned about this proposal to cut the pension. He doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink, and he can get by on the single-age pension. But if we bring that pension down from 28% of average weekly earnings to 16% of average weekly earnings, as would happen if you indexed it to inflation, then people like Bill in the future will really be thrown back into poverty.
But what the government's saying about that now is that they won't move on that. They might delay it until the budget returns to surplus. In other words, they will not fix pensions to inflation until the budget returns to surplus. Is that a situation that Labor can accept?
No, we believe it's reasonable that pensioners share in cost of living improvements, Barry. I think this is a really fundamental question for Australia, which if Mr Abbott wanted to put it on the table, he should have taken it to the last election. Pensioners have in the past shared in productivity gains in Australia. But if you link pensions to prices rather than wages, you take away that valuable link.
But they've come back with an approach that is certainly a gentler approach. It's drawn out over a longer period of time. It's an olive branch in that sense, and yet you say no to that.
Barry, I'm not sure you can say something is gentle when it's taking away a payment which goes to some of the lowest income Australians. You know, when Labor increased the pension in 2009, on one estimate we took 1 million people out of poverty. That's because the pension is very carefully targeted to the most vulnerable in our community. And so while at the same time Mr Abbott and Mr Hockey are giving $1 billion back to multinationals, not pursuing measures that would see people with more than $2 million in their superannuation accounts taxed fairly, on the other hand, they're cutting the pension and they're cutting the wages of the cleaners who clean their own offices. That's against the great egalitarian spirit of a nation that believes we ought to be a country of mate rather than sir, of sitting in the front seat of taxis, of treating the most vulnerable as best we can.
Just finally, Joe Hockey yesterday was still keeping open the option of allowing people to access their superannuation along the journey. Not specifically for first home buying, but perhaps for paying for retraining and that kind of thing. Given that perhaps the system needs more flexibility, there's a lot of money being locked up along the journey, do you think that has some merit?
I am concerned, Barry, that it's at odds with what Matthias Cormann's been saying on this. So, frankly, I don't know where the government is at on this particular thought bubble. But you've got to be concerned about a measure that doesn't address housing supply. All of the experts recognise that housing supply is the main constraint in Australia. Schemes like sustainable housing, National Rental Affordability Scheme, which were part of our global financial crisis response, went some way to addressing the challenge of housing supply. But I've got to say, I raise an eyebrow at a measure which not only doesn't boost housing supply, but also erodes retirement savings. A government led by somebody who said that universal superannuation was a con job is now pausing the increases in superannuation, raising superannuation on low-income earners, and seeming to do too little to make sure that the great Australian superannuation system is sustainable into the future.
Andrew Leigh, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, Barry.